Good morning. It's so great to be with you. I want to thank my father for allowing me the privilege of preaching in his absence. And I want to invite you to take your Bibles, please, and open them with me to Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14. As I was thinking about what to preach on this morning, normally at my church, I don't have to think about what to preach next because we're going through a book right now. We're going through the book of Genesis, and so I just preach on whatever's next in the book. But as I was praying about what to preach on this morning, one of the things that I'm really burdened about in the church today is I believe the enemy is in many ways dividing the church in ways that it ought not to divide, on things that it ought not to divide over. And in so doing, he's hindering the mission of the church to make disciples when he does that. And so here's what I want to look at today as we turn to Romans 14. I want to talk about what it looks like to have differences without divisions. What it looks like to have differences without divisions. It is indeed possible to disagree with someone and still get along with them. Did you know that? A couple of y'all knew that. All right. That's what we're going to see in Romans 14. So when you found Romans 14, beginning in verse 1, please follow along with me as I read down through verse 12. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Rome, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, says this: "As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes that he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God." Let's pray together. Father, we ask your blessing right now upon us as we turn our attention to your word. And we pray the simple prayer of Jesus in John chapter 17, the great high priestly prayer where he said, "O Lord, I pray that they may be one, even as the Father and the Son are one." We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I want to begin this morning with a little Baptist trivia. Is that okay? Does that sound fun to y'all as we get started? All right. Somebody said yes, so I'm going to keep going. Here's the Baptist trivia. I want you to think of an answer to this question in your heads. You don't have to say it out loud, but just think of your answer in your head. How many Baptist denominations do you think there are in the United States of America? How many? So you be thinking about that. What do you think the number is? How many Baptists? I'm not even talking about the Methodists and all those other ones. I'm talking about just Baptist denominations. How many different ones do you think there are in the United States alone? Okay? All right, you got your number, and you can't Google it. Don't Google it. Here's the number, okay? There are 62 Baptist denominations just in our own country. And I'm going to list them for you right now. And I'm just kidding, not all of them, but I am going to give you a taste, okay, so you can see what I'm talking about. Here are some of the 62 Baptist denominations in our country. There's the American Baptist Association, the Association of Reformed Baptist Churches of America, the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, Baptist Bible Fellowship International, Baptist General Conference, Christian Unity Baptist Association, Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, Enterprise Association of Regular Baptists, Free Will Baptist, Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship, Fundamental Baptist Fellowship Association, Fundamental Baptist Fellowship of America, General Association of Baptists, General Association of General Baptists, General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. All right, take a breath. We're halfway through my list, okay? General Six Principal Baptists, Independent Baptist Church of America, Independent Baptist Fellowship International, Independent Baptist Fellowship of North America, Institutional Missionary Baptist Conference of America, Interstate and Foreign Landmark Missionary Baptist Association, National Baptist Evangelical Life and Soul Saving Assembly of the USA, Old Regular Baptists. I kid you not. Some people had had enough. We're just going to be Old Regular Baptists. Old-time Missionary Baptists, Primitive Baptist Universalists, Separate Baptists in Christ, Two-Seed in the Spirit, Predestinarian Baptists, United American Free Will Baptist Church, United American Free Will Baptist Conference. Those are 30 of the 62. Now listen, I'm Baptist by conviction. I'm Baptist by birth, almost. But even I can see that this is a bit much, all right? I think we've gone overboard a little bit. Why are there so many different denominations just even among Baptists? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because somewhere along the way, every time a group of people had even a small, slight disagreement over secondary things, rather than staying united and doing the work that is involved in having differences without divisions, rather than doing that, they decided that it would be easier to just separate and part ways. And I believe that Paul is telling us in this letter to the Roman church, he's telling us that the tendency to splinter like that is wrong. It's wrong. It's wrong. Now, I believe this is something that the church is facing today. I believe that our churches today are being tempted by the enemy to divide over non-essential things. I believe that our convention of churches is on the verge of doing that today in some ways, to divide over non-essential things. I've basically gotten off of social media for the most part. One of the reasons is because I'm just so sick and tired of all the arguing that goes on many of those platforms. I heard one pastor say one time, we got some Christians in our churches that post more than they pray. Amen? And listen, if some people, even some Christians, would spend half of the time and energy that they're currently using fighting with each other, instead use that energy to tell people about the gospel, we'd be winning the world to Christ a lot quicker than we are right now. I'll tell you that. Division hinders the mission. And this is not a new tactic of the enemy. This is an old tactic of the enemy. He was doing it in the Roman church. And Paul was having to deal with a church that, because they were made up of fallen human beings like we are in every generation, he was having to deal with a church that had a tendency to divide over all their differences, even the non-essential secondary ones. And Paul is saying, don't do that. If I were to summarize to you what I believe the message of these 12 verses from Romans 14 is saying, it's this, that when it comes to secondary issues, now, I'm not talking about primary ones and essential ones. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that when it comes to secondary issues, we must not let our differences divide us. Now, that's easier said than done. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that we don't let differences over secondary issues divide us? Well, let's see what Paul has to say to the early church in Rome about that very subject. First of all, what Paul tells us in verses 1 through 4 is that if we're going to have differences without divisions, then first, we must welcome differences of opinion. Everybody say that with me. We must welcome differences of opinion. And all the opinionated people in the room, including me, have to say, oh me, because we can't say amen on that, right? What do you mean welcome people with differences of opinion? They're wrong. Well, let's see what Paul says about that. Notice what he says in verse 1. He says, as for the one who is weak in faith, do what to him? Welcome him. But notice, but not so that you can quarrel over opinions. Oh, I'll welcome them all right, and then we're going to have a real big argument. No. Welcome them, but not so that you can quarrel over opinions. Now, the question is, Paul, the main verb in verse 1 is, welcome this person. Who is the person that we're called to welcome? The one, he says, who is weak in faith. Now, when Paul talks about the person who's weak in faith, he's not talking about a lost person. They have faith. It's just not strong, okay? So when he talks about the person who's weak in the faith, as we'll see in just a moment as we get further in the text, he's talking about people, maybe they're new to the faith, maybe they've been a Christian for a while, but for some reason they've got some areas in their understanding of the Bible and of the faith, they've got some areas of their theology that have some holes in it. They've got some areas of doctrine where they're just not quite up to par yet. They've got some places in the Bible that they don't quite understand yet. Now, raise your hand if that's ever been you. Raise your hand if that's you right now. I mean, look, at some level, all of us are weak in the faith if what you mean by that is that we don't understand the Bible perfectly, or that there are places in our theology that we may not have all figured out yet. And the reality is that's really at some place in our life, that's all of us. None of us, even the most educated person in this room, none of us have all of our doctrine and all of our theology figured out yet, which means that in a group like this, there are going to be lots of different opinions. In fact, it's been said that in a room where 5 Baptists are present, there are 10 different opinions. Now, specifically in this context, when Paul talks about the weak brother, it involves here, specifically, it involves believing that some things are sinful when they're really not. He was dealing with some people who were legalists. They believed that some things were sinful when they really weren't. And that's what he means by a weak person here in this context. He lists 2 things that were happening in the Roman church that they were debating and that some people were weak in their understanding over. He lists them for us in this passage. It's one, there were some people who thought it was wrong to ever eat meat. They were weak in their understanding. And then there were others who thought that certain days of the year were more holy than others, and the church calendar ought to honor that. And Paul says that they were too. They were also weak in the faith. There were some people in the church of Paul's day who were really convicted about those things, even though there was not really biblical support for their position. And this is why he calls them weak in their faith. They were raising their opinions to the level of God's laws and of God's word. And let me tell you, that's a very dangerous place to be. We all have a tendency to do that sometimes. So watch this. Weak here in verse 1, when Paul says the weak brother, welcome him, the one who's weak in the faith. Weak means that they were wrong about some secondary doctrinal belief. They weren't wrong about the gospel, you see. They were wrong about food and holy days. They weren't wrong about Jesus. They were wrong on some secondary things, and yet Paul says that what are we to do with them? We are to welcome them. Welcome them. And not to quarrel over opinions. Now, he gives a specific example of one of those areas where people were weak in the Roman church, down in verse 2. Notice what it says again in verse 2. I mentioned it earlier, but let's unpack it a little bit. It says in verse 2, he says, for instance, here's an example of someone who's weak in the faith, even in Paul's day. Verse 2, one person believes that he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. That's going to be somebody's life verse today, by the way, I think. The weak person eats only vegetables. Somebody's going to claim that one as they leave today. Now, in this specific case, the misunderstanding of these people who are weak in the faith, not fully developed in their understanding of the Bible, they were thinking that it was wrong to ever eat meat. Maybe they were thinking that because they understood some of the Old Testament and how in the Old Testament there were some laws about how you couldn't eat certain kinds of meat, right? And so they knew that, but they were kind of taking it a step further. It's as if they were thinking, God's got his fence, the law. He tells us not to go beyond by giving us certain commands and eat this and don't eat this. God's got his fence of the law, but just to play it safe, I'm going to build my smaller fence inside God's bigger fence just so that I won't get too close to the edge. Now, at one level, you may admire people like that. Man, they're really, really living a strict life. But in reality, that's not a good place to be. God is much better at providing and giving spiritual laws than you and I are. Let's let God give the laws. Let's just be responsible for obeying what he tells us to do. Let's don't build our own fences. It's wrong to take away from God's word and laws. It's also wrong to add to God's word and laws, okay? And that's what these people were doing. So they were taking it one step further. But notice Paul says this in verse 3. What are you to do when you've got a situation in a church like Rome where you've got some people who are weak and think, man, you can't have meat at the church potluck? And then you've got some others that are like, no, we think we should have meat at the church potluck. If you don't want it, just don't eat it, okay? And this argument is happening inside the church. What do you do? Verse 3, notice what Paul says. Here's how you welcome people. Here's what it means. Let not the one who eats the one who is strong in the faith and understands it's okay to eat meat. It's okay. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains. And let not the one who abstains and thinks they shouldn't ever eat meat, let them not pass judgment on the one who eats. In verse 1, Paul says, welcome one another. In verse 3, he's telling us what that looks like. What does it look like to welcome someone who differs from you on, let's say, this specific issue of whether or not we should eat meat? Well, what it looks like is if you're strong and you know that it's okay to eat meat, and you've got a brother or sister who you think's wrong, and they're weak in the faith, and they think that they must eat only vegetables, and a debate occurs, here's what that means. Do not despise your weaker brother. Don't despise them. What does that mean? Well, it means this. The strong who are actually correct, that they're free to eat meat, should not despise the one who thinks that it's wrong. In other words, the strong should not say or think of the weak, you idiot, you're wrong. You just haven't progressed in your understanding enough to know it yet. And despise that person and look down on them in their heart. Likewise, the weak person who thinks it's wrong to eat meat and who's really, they're weak in their understanding and they're being a legalist, they should not, he says, pass judgment on the one who eats. Pass judgment. Why? Because when you have a weak person who's got a legalistic mindset and they think something is sinful even when it's not, when they see somebody eating meat and they think it's a sin to do so, their tendency is to pass judgment on them and think that they're sinning. And Paul says, don't do that. Don't pass judgment on them. No, instead of the strong despising the weak, and instead of the weak passing judgment on the strong, both the strong and the weak should, verse 1, welcome one another, but not to quarrel over opinions, which means this. It means they're going to have to agree to disagree agreeably. They're going to have to agree to disagree on this over this secondary thing. They're going to have to agree to disagree agreeably. St. Augustine once said it this way. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. Now note this. When Paul says, welcome each other, even if you disagree, he's not saying that both sides are equally right. The one who is being the legalist here and says, no, you guys can't eat meat, that's a sin. He calls them weak. It's not good to be weak in the faith, right? We want to be strong in the faith, ideally. We want to be strong in our understanding of Scriptures and more fully developed in our understanding of theology and what the Bible teaches us. And so Paul's not saying that both sides are equally right. Paul's saying, no, the weak are weak, and that's not good, and the strong are correct, but he's just saying you can both disagree and still get along and still be one in the body of Christ. Secondary issues like that, Paul says, are not hills worth dying on. They're not even hills worth dividing on, Paul is telling us. We should stay united despite them. And then notice what he says at the end of verse 3 and on into verse 4. What's the major reason that we should welcome each other despite our disagreements and differences on secondary issues like this? What's the main reason? Well, notice what he says at the end of verse 3. For, here's the reason, you should do this, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment, verse 4, on the servant of another? It's before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. God has welcomed him, and if God has welcomed him, don't you think you ought to as well? The ultimate reason you and I should welcome a fellow Christian with whom we disagree over secondary issues is because God already has. God welcomes people who don't have perfect theology. Aren't you glad about that? If that wasn't true, he wouldn't have welcomed you or me. God welcomes people who might be wrong on some secondary doctrinal issue. God welcomes people who don't have the Bible completely figured out yet. And if God can welcome someone that you disagree with, then why can't you? If God can welcome someone that you disagree with over a secondary thing, why can't you? How dare we reject someone that God has accepted? Now, I hear what you're saying in the back of some of your minds, but aren't there some things that we should divide over? And the answer is absolutely yes. And we'll talk about some of those. I'll give you some specifics in a minute. But here's the big question, okay? What we need is maturity in the faith. We need the discernment. We need to be able to discern what are the things that we have to agree on, right? And then what are the things that we can agree to disagree on? It takes maturity and discernment to know that. And here's the best way I know to illustrate it. I came across this illustration several years ago in an article I read by Al Mohler. And it's like this. He says it's like when you go into an emergency room, okay? If you've been into an ER lately, a couple years ago, we had 3 of our 5 kids that in a 2-month time span all broke their right foot. Don't ask me how. And it was all different. One was like a trampoline, one was a bunk bed. And we got real used to the ER. But when you walk into an emergency room, there's going to be people in there with all different kinds of things wrong with them, right? Some people are coming in with like a broken pinky toe. And another person might be carried in with a gunshot wound to the chest. And here is what emergency room doctors and nurses have to do. It's something called triage. It's a French word for to sort. They've got to be able to have the discernment to sort through what are the really pressing issues that are coming into the emergency room right now. All the issues that people have as they come in here, all of them are important. None of them are not important. All of them are important, but some of them are more urgent than others. Some of them are more important and more essential than others. And how do we sort through them? By looking at what is most essential and most pressing and what is less essential and less pressing. And so if I'm the one coming in with a broken toe and behind me there's someone with a gunshot wound, I want them to skip in front of me, right? Like you guys get help first. You need it, right? That's how we should do that. And here's the issue. We need to be able to do theological triage. We need to be able to read the Bible and say, you know what? All of it is important, but some of it is essential. And we must agree over these things. And some of it is important, but not to the point that we must agree over all of it. And let me give you some examples of the kind of things that I'm talking about to illustrate this. So, for example, some things are indeed essential. And let me just press onto this point. There are some things that we absolutely must agree on to even be able to consider one another Christians. There are some things that the church cannot disagree on and should divide on if it comes to that over essential issues. And Paul is not saying that we should welcome someone who disagrees on those primary essential things. He's saying we should welcome people who disagree on secondary things. But what are some of those primary things? Well, let me give you just a few. The Trinity, for instance. The Bible teaches that there's one God who exists in 3 persons, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. We just sang a worship song that praised God for being 3 in 1. We must agree on that. We're talking about who God is. If you don't believe in the Trinity, you've got a different God. We must agree on that. How about this one? The full deity and humanity of Jesus Christ. There is no wiggle room in our faith to have disagreements on whether or not Jesus is fully divine and fully man. We must agree on that, or else you're in a different religion. How about this one? Justification and salvation by faith alone. We are not saved by works. We're saved by grace through faith. You have something else in there, and it's a different religion altogether. Or what about this one? The authority of the Bible. That the Bible is the inspired, inerrant Word of God. There have been times, and even in our denomination's history, where we have had to divide over issues just like that, and it was right to do so. Those are primary, essential things. In fact, Paul rebuked the Apostle Peter one time. You can read about this in Galatians 2. For him being wrong over a primary and essential issue. So Paul's not saying that we should disregard those things, that we should get along with people even if they disagree with us over essential things, but we also know that there are also secondary issues. There are secondary doctrinal issues that we can agree to disagree on. Let me give you some of those. For example, how will the end times play out specifically? Did you know that people disagree on that sometimes in the church? I heard Dr. Rogers say one time, I'm not an amillennialist or a premillennialist. I'm a pan-millennialist. I think everything's just going to pan out eventually in the end, right? How about this one? The relationship between God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. Are there any disagreements on that in the church? There are, and we should be able to agree to disagree on that. How about speaking in tongues and whether or not the miraculous gifts continue on today? An important issue, but should we divide over it if we disagree with someone? Absolutely not. Here are some more. Should Christians drink alcohol? After all, everyone knows the disciples and Jesus drank Welch's grape juice. How should Christians educate their children? Public school, private school, or homeschool? You want to get to a fierce debate with people? Start throwing out some of those things on social media. What kind of clothes should you wear to church? Which Bible translation is best? Can you bring a drink inside the sanctuary? Like you will get thrown out of some churches for bringing a drink inside their sanctuary quicker than if you had held to a heretical belief about the Trinity. Let me tell you that. What kind of worship songs should we sing in church? Can a Christian ever listen to secular music? Should Christians watch certain TV shows? If you're a Christian, do you have to vote Republican, Democrat, or Libertarian? Listen, when it comes to many of these things, Paul is not saying that they are unimportant. He's just saying they're not as important as the essential things, and that we can have differences of opinion without dividing on many of these things. That's what he's saying. And it's important that we do so. So first, when it comes to secondary doctrinal issues, we must welcome differences of opinion, as hard as that might be. Then number two, Paul tells us that if we're going to have differences without division, then secondly, you must be true to your own conscience. When it comes to your opinions about secondary issues, you should be true to your own conscience. Now, Paul is not saying, as he talks about this in verses 5 through 9, he's not saying that our conscience is the ultimate authority for what's right and wrong. Your conscience is not the ultimate authority for what's right and wrong. The Bible is. But as we've already established, we can read the Bible and come away with different interpretations on some of those secondary, non-essential issues. So what do we do when that happens? What do we do when we have a disagreement over a secondary issue in the church? Well, you must be true to your own conscience when it comes to that. Notice what it says in verse 5. He says, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Now, here's the second issue that the Roman church was dealing with. The first area of division and disagreement was, can you eat meat or not? The second area of disagreement and division in verse 5 was, should we consider all days alike, or are some days more holy than others? And this was causing theological debate. One holds to this view, one holds to that view, Paul says in verse 5. At the end of verse 5 he says this, each one should be fully convinced, where? In his own mind. So over the issue of can you eat meat, over the issue now in verse 5 of are some days more holy than others in the Christian calendar, or are all days just as holy as all other days, that kind of thing, should we divide over that? And Paul says, no, you should welcome one another, and here's how you do that. Each one must be fully convinced in his own mind. Now, this issue, too, whether or not certain days of the week or year were more holy than others, probably comes from an Old Testament background where you had, for instance, in the Roman church, probably some Christians who were converted out of Jewish backgrounds, and they knew that there were Jewish holy days. Think about the 3 big festival days, like Passover, for instance, and that was a big deal for the people of Israel. And so now many of those Jewish people who had become Christians and believed in Jesus as the Messiah, they're in this Roman church along with Gentiles who don't have that Jewish background. And maybe some of them are saying, you know what, Passover is really important, and we should put that on the church calendar, and we should all recognize it as more holy than other days. And then you had other Christians who were saying, yeah, I get that the significance of Passover, and we can honor that, but really Jesus now, as he's made a new covenant with us, he has established that all days are just as holy as all other days. And so there was this disagreement that was arising. And Paul's solution is, don't divide over that, welcome one another, and in particular, he gives us another tidbit here in the end of verse 5, be fully convinced, each person, where? In his own mind. So Paul's solution is this, study the Bible. The message of Paul here is not, don't think the Bible is important. The message is, yes, study the Bible. And even over secondary things, study whatever is in the Bible. Be convinced in your own mind. Just don't let your differences as you do that divide you from others who come to a different conclusion on some of those things. Paul is saying, look, you're not going to be able to convince everyone of every single thing you believe. Did you know that? This is why he said, let everyone be fully convinced where? In his own mind. You're not going to be able to convince everybody else's mind to be exactly like your mind and to think exactly the way you do on every single secondary issue. You say, well, Pastor, well, I'm sure going to try. Well, please don't. Like Paul is saying, don't try. Welcome your brother, but not to quarrel over opinions. The key is each one must be convinced in his own mind. When it comes to those secondary things, talk about them, yes. But the main thing is, do you know what you believe? Are you content with that conviction? And can you live with people who might disagree with you over those secondary issues? So you won't be able to convince everybody of everything you believe. In fact, I believe you'll stay busy just convincing yourself of what you believe. My parents used to tell me, Grant, mind your own business and you'll have your hands full. If you mind your own business, you won't have much time to mind everybody else's. What matters most is the motivation of a person's heart. When it comes to secondary things that tend to divide us, what matters most is that not that we agree, that we come to a place where we all think the same way about all those secondary things. We've got to think the same way about the essential things. But what matters most is not that we come to the place where all of us agree with all the secondary things. That's not required to have unity. What matters most is not full agreement on those things. What matters most is the motivation of one's heart. Notice how Paul says that in verse 6. He says this in verse 6. The one who observes the day, who does think, some days are more holy than others, and I'm going to observe that day. The one who observes the day, why does he do it? What's his motivation? He observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats the meat doesn't think it's wrong to eat meat. What's he doing there? Why is he doing it? What's his motivation? He eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains from the meat thinks it is wrong to eat meat. What's their motivation? They're abstaining it says in verse 6, in honor of the Lord. They give thanks to God. Paul is saying, you take these issues of that he's mentioned here. Can you eat meat or not? And are some days more holy than others? And you've got people on both sides of the divide on those issues. And Paul is saying that the most important thing and what unites them is not their full agreement on those issues. What unites them is that in their hearts are still in the right place, and they're wanting to do what they're doing to the honor of the Lord. Even if you disagree and you're on polar opposite sides of secondary things like this, as long as both sides and both people want to honor the Lord, their heart's in the right place, and God considers that more important than anything else. So the person who says, no, it's wrong to eat meat, why are they doing that? Why are they being so strict? Because they believe, even though they're wrong, they believe they're doing it in honor of the Lord. The person who eats is enjoying their Christian liberty. And is saying, no, this is a good gift from God, and I'm doing it in honor of the Lord. They understand what Paul says in 1 Timothy 4, verses 4 and 5, where Paul says this, for everything created by God is good, talking about food, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving. Amen? That's the verse I claim every Thanksgiving. As I'm looking at the spread, nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving. Amen. For it is made holy by the word of God and prayer. It's a good gift from God. And what matters is that whatever you're doing, whether you're the weak person or the strong person, you're doing it so that you can honor the Lord. And if we can get there, we can all be unified. Paul says this in verses 7 through 9. He says in verse 7, for none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord. And if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. Paul is saying in verses 7 through 9, does a person believe that? Do they believe, verse 9, that Christ died and lived again, that he may be Lord over both the dead and the living? Okay, if he believes the gospel, you can be united with him. Does a person believe, verses 7 and 8, that life is about living for Christ? That if we live, it's for the Lord. If we die, it's for the Lord. As Paul says in Philippians, to live is Christ and to die is gain. I believe the gospel, and I believe the most important thing is that I want to live for Jesus. Do you believe in that? Well, then even if you're on opposite sides of some secondary issue, if both of you believe the gospel and both of you believe that life is about living for Jesus, you can stay united and be on mission together for Christ, even though you disagree. The heart's the most important thing. It really is. You know, sometimes we can make small mistakes, and as long as our heart's in the right place, it's okay, because it's the thought that counts, right? Our daughter is sitting here with us. We got 4 of our 5 kids with us in the room right now, and our oldest daughter, Olivia, is about to turn 15 before her 14th birthday. She had a birthday party, and she invited a bunch of her friends over. We had 15 ninth grade girls spending the night with us that night. And at the time, we had our 5 kids and also 3 foster children. We had 8 kids of our own plus 15 ninth grade girls. And I think we're probably breaking a fire code in there some way or another. But they all gave her gifts, and we had the birthday party. And I was looking through some of the birthday cards that her friends had given to her, and one of them caught my eye. And I began to read it. And it was interesting. It said, "Happy birthday, Grandma." Right, this was given to my 14-year-old daughter. "Happy birthday, Grandma." Have you ever done that where you bought the wrong card for somebody and you had this embarrassing moment, right? And here's the reality. Her friend bought the wrong card. It was a little bit strange, but it was the thought that counts, right? And like her heart was in the right place. I'm giving you this gift, even though it was the wrong one. I'm giving it to honor you. And Paul is saying that's what's important. Is the person in the church that you disagree with? Are they doing what they're doing because they want to honor the Lord? Are they believing what they are believing because they want to honor the Lord? Okay, well, if it's a secondary thing, even if they're wrong, you stay united with them because they're wanting to honor the Lord. They're wanting to live for Christ. So when it comes to secondary doctrinal issues, we must welcome differences of opinion. We must be true to our own conscience. And then thirdly and finally, notice with me how Paul concludes in verses 10 through 12. We must, if we want to have differences without division, we must leave accountability to God. He ends the passage this way in verse 10. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of whom? Did anyone notice that their name wasn't there? We will all stand before the judgment seat, not of Grant's, not of whatever your name is. We will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then each one of us will give an account of himself to God. Paul is saying what he says similarly elsewhere in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10, where he says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. And here's the reality. When you understand the fact that one day, when the end comes, you will stand by yourself before a holy God and give an account for everything you've done and everything you've thought and everything you've said and everything you've believed, and you will stand before that God to give an account, and he is the judge of all the earth, and he will do right. If you know that you will stand before God one day in judgment in all of his holiness, it will make you think twice about trying to take the place of God and pass judgment on somebody else in this earth. That's what Paul's saying. You leave the judgment, the final judgment. You leave that accountability to God. And here's the reality. When we get to heaven, and not before then, when we get to heaven, we're going to find out everywhere that we've been wrong in our theology. All of us are wrong somewhere. We just don't know where it is yet, right? And when we get to heaven, we're going to find that out. And Paul is telling us that until that time comes, let's err on the side of being gracious. Let's err on the side of welcoming people who disagree with us, not on primary issues, but on secondary ones. Let's know that the only one who will ultimately sort it all out in the end is the judge that we're all going to stand before one day. Listen, theology is very important. I've devoted much of my life to the study of theology. But the unity of the church is also important. The unity of the church is very important. Jesus prayed in John 17, I pray that they may be one. So let's insist that we agree on the essentials. But let's agree to disagree on the non-essentials. And let me just tell you this. The reason most churches or denominations split is not over essential issues. The reason that there are 62 Baptist denominations in the United States of America is not because they were all dividing over the gospel. They were dividing over their preferences much of the time and secondary things that we ought not to divide over. And again, Paul is saying that the tendency to do that is wrong. Now, here's the reality. I doubt we'll ever be able to unite all Christian denominations who actually believe the true gospel. I doubt we'll ever be able to unite them in this life before Jesus comes again. I doubt that we'll ever even be able to unite all 62 Baptist denominations that believe the gospel before Jesus comes again. But why don't we start right here, right now? Why don't we start in our own churches? Why don't we start in our own Bible fellowship groups? Why don't we start in our own community and Christian community? Why don't we determine that we're not going to let those secondary differences divide us? Because we know that if the enemy can divide us, he can conquer us. If the enemy can divide us, he can distract us from the mission, and that we're better together. Why don't we do that? How? Well, let's welcome differences of opinion. Let's be true to our own conscience. And let's leave accountability to God. Amen?